Well, howdy everyone, my name's Chris and today I'm reviewing yet another fast standard zoom lens. This time I have the image stabilized Tamron 17-50mm f2.8 VC lens. Don't mix this up with its older brother, the Tamron 17-50mm f2.8 non-VC lens. I reviewed that little bad boy a while ago, and despite its oldness and lack of image stabilization, it turned out to be pretty nice. Today I've got Tamron's newer, image stabilized version of the lens. Now, fast standard zoom lenses are fantastic. Lots of professional photographers rely on them for their general photography, and this happens to be one of the least expensive on the whole market. It has a fast f2.8 maximum aperture throughout its entire zoom range. That means it lets in much more light than a typical kit lens. That makes it much easier to shoot video or still photos in dark situations, for example, nighttime or indoors. Another cool advantage is that you can get a much blurrier background at f2.8 than your kit lens does at f5.6. Here you can see the difference between f2.8 and f5.6. So this lens has some use for narrow depth of field photography like portrait work. The focal length of 17-50mm is about the same as your kit lens, so wide angle to short telephoto. This Tamron lens has a constant maximum aperture of f2.8, so you won't get any annoying changes in light levels as you zoom in and out, like on your average kit lens. Again, that makes it all the more useful for video work. As I mentioned before, this is the cheapest image stabilized fast standard zoom lens available, and it kind of feels like it. It's generally slightly wobbly. The good news is that the zoom ring is fairly smooth and precise, so again, that's pretty nice for video work. But I don't like the focus ring on this lens very much. It's not very smooth or well damped, and it suffers from this very slight stickiness that makes precise focusing kind of annoying. And the lens doesn't have full-time manual focusing, so you shouldn't try to turn that focus ring when it's set to autofocus. The autofocus motor on this lens is pretty outdated. It's not very fast and it's pretty noisy, as you can hear here. The focus ring turns as it focuses, but at least the front element of the lens doesn't move. In testing, the lens's autofocus was at least pretty accurate. One thing I do like with the lens's build quality is the image stabilization, or VC. It's very effective and it runs smoothly while you're doing video work. It makes a very low rumbling noise while it's running, unlike other lenses which often make annoying clicking sounds, so I think that's a bit better. Overall, the build quality is okay. It would certainly be good enough for video work, but the whole focusing system is a bit sorry and outdated. Let's look at the all-important image quality. This lens is for APS-C digital cameras only, so I've tested it on my trusty 18-megapixel Canon 6DD camera. Let's take a close look at the performance at 17mm. With the aperture wide open at f2.8, the lens is nice and sharp in the middle, which is a good start, so let's look in those more troublesome corners. We see that the relatively inexpensive Tamron lens is still nice and sharp. Great. There's a little bit of chromatic aberration, also known as colour fringing, on contrasting edges. But it's not too much, which is actually a good performance. In order to improve image quality, stop the lens's aperture down to f4. The lens becomes very sharp across the whole image frame, which is very encouraging to see. If we zoom the lens into 35mm, about halfway through the zoom range, we can see that at f2.8, the image quality has taken a bit of a turn downwards. Look closely and you can see that the lens is reasonably sharp in the middle, but not fantastic, and the contrast levels are poor, which doesn't help anything. And the corners are really rather soft at f2.8. This is a bit of a disappointment, as this lens's non-image stabilized older brother actually performed much better. Stopping the lens down to f4 brings about an acceptable level of sharpness in the corners, but the middle of the image still isn't anything to get completely excited about. So it's a comparatively weak show at 35mm. Finally, let's zoom the lens all the way into 50mm. If we look closely at the image at f2.8, again we see an acceptable level of sharpness, but nothing special, and again we see below average contrast levels. The picture quality in the corners is also pretty soft, with gentle ghosting on contrasting edges. At least there's no chromatic aberration. There's a bit of an improvement in sharpness when you stop the lens down to f4, but it's still rather mediocre, although the picture quality in the middle has become fairly sharp. So overall, we can say that this lens's image quality generally reflects its inexpensive price. Admittedly, everything comes up roses at 17mm with great picture quality, but zoom in further and there's a lack of contrast and the lens is soft compared to the competition. For example, the Sigma 17-50mm f2.8 OS costs only a little more money, but is much sharper optically. The image quality isn't even as good as Tamron's original 17-50mm f2.8 lens, so while the lens's image quality isn't exactly awful, it is disappointing. It's plenty sharp enough for video work, but anyone as picky as me about lens sharpness should probably look for something a little better. Moving on, let's look at distortion. At 17mm, the lens produces an awful lot of barrel distortion, more than average for a zoom lens. This is quite annoying, as it will need sorting out in editing, and you definitely don't want barrel distortion while you're shooting video. Thankfully, it's almost gone by the time you zoom into 24mm, turning into mild pincushion distortion at 50mm. Overall, another below average performance. However, you can see that the lens doesn't really have any major problems with vignetting or darkness in the corners, so that's good news, especially as it has a slightly smaller front element than the competition. The lens can focus reasonably close to your subjects, so it's perfectly usable for getting photos of flowers or other small objects. The close-up image quality is not particularly good, being really quite soft at f2.8. The quality at f4 is reasonable, and it's pretty good at f5.6. The lens doesn't really work too well against bright lights, as you can see here. There's a big drop in contrast even when the light is slightly out of the picture, and there's lots of lens flare too. I'm happy to say that the quality of the bokeh, or out of focus areas, is generally okay on this lens. At 50mm it looks fairly smooth, and this is more or less maintained at wider angles too, as you can see here at 17mm. Well, let's sum this up. I've reviewed a lot of fast standard zoom lenses recently, and it's clear that this one is behind the competition in terms of image quality and autofocus performance. But at the same time, I don't want to be a snob. A lot of people will buy this lens and be very happy with it. It still performs okay, and you'd be able to get great pictures with it. It's just that the competition makes it look kind of bad. And it's also very inexpensive, and the image stabilization works very nicely. But at the end of the day, you'd probably do better to save up just a little more money and get the Sigma 17-50mm f2.8 OS, which is much better optically.